had a great conversation with Mike Oreskes, who spent decades as a top executive at the legacy media companies like the New York Times, the Associated Press, and NPR, kind of the opposite of what I did. My main question, what in the heck happened to the news media?
So first of all, thank you. I appreciate you. I was thinking this morning, on paper, I really shouldn't like you. It's like I'm looking at your resume and I spent my life at Fox. I believe that the media has way tilted to the left and it is now so disjointed and not paying it, choosing politics over truth and pretending to still be fair and balanced, to coin an old phrase. And looking at your resume, which is amazing on in that world, it's New York Times, it's AP, it's Daily News, it's International AP for nearly a decade.
Yeah, the International Herald Tribune. Yeah, may it rest in peace.
But you and I, AP might be next. You and I have always gotten along so well because we actually cared about the essence of truth underneath all of the food fight.
Yeah,
and from my aspect, it feels like journalism has completely gone off the rails and gone to a place that it was in the late 1800s, early 1900s in America. Does it feel that way for you too?
Yeah, I worry a lot. First of all, thank you, Ken. I feel the same about you, whatever that means. Right? And maybe that is part of what drew us together, was that while we have very different backgrounds in terms of our careers in media, I think we do share a concern that things have run off the rails, because I think they have. And I think there's a lot of reasons for it, and they're not all about media, frankly. I think some of them are about the society in general that media has just latched onto or took advantage of for commercial reasons. But I think we do share a worry that it's going too far, that we live in a country that was built on the idea that we would disagree with each other. That's actually inherent. And things like the bemoaning of polarization really are kind of ahistoric. I mean, this country's had long periods of polarization. It's not the polarization in itself. It's the willingness to let go of even basic facts in the pursuit of a point of view. And I see that happening in politics. I see it happening in media. And I think that's unfortunate and scary.
Did you see it starting to fall apart when you were on the inside, or
Yes.
did it take you being, and how did you first start noticing that and when?
Well, I have to say, I first started noticing this challenge as a journalist simply covering things. And in fact, in 1991, maybe, we could go look it up, but I wrote a series for the New York Times called The Trouble with Politics. And it described and quoted quite a number of people on both left and right, talking about the phenomenon they were beginning to see happening, where it was impossible to discuss seriously challenging issues because things were so polarized, as they put it then. And I went back a year or so ago and I reread that series and I thought, wow, if they only knew what was really coming. They'd only seen what was fully coming. But I do think that was when I first began to sense that things were shifting. And that series had some things in it about media, including the rise of cable niche television. Wasn't specifically about Fox at that point, but it was more that there were these all news cable channels that were dividing and fragmenting things, and they were contributing. I don't believe they were the source of fragmentation, but I do believe they helped contribute or exacerbate it, or frankly, they gave people who wanted to be in their own little tribe, they gave them a place to go. And that was one of the problems. I think there was also just a general problem in both print and visual medium of oversimplifying and boiling things down and going from a complicated issue with lots of shades of gray to a simple soundbite. Remember soundbites? We used to talk about soundbites as a worrisome thing. Now they look like the Oxford English Dictionary. The problem has been a while in the making. I mean, we've been digging this hole for quite some time now, because that was 1990. So that was 30 something years ago. And so I'd say that's when I first started to realize that some tides were running that were going to carry us away if we didn't do anything. And we didn't.
And those were literally the quaint old days. I mean,
right. Those were, I look back and think, wow, that was.
Yeah, it was pretty good.
Yeah.
So I saw two things when when I came in with Fox, we strongly believed the whole kind of TV world is 30 degrees to the left, and we're going to come in 15 degrees to the right, and we're going to suck up this massive audience because we're the only people there. And I think it's worked as a financial model for them pretty well. And it's kind of, we had in my view, the flip problem back then. The flip problem is everybody was saying the same thing, and there was a political spin to it. It was just all exactly the same spin, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, whatever was in the New York Times was going to lead ABC, CBS, NBC News national broadcast that afternoon. And the guys, you squint your eyes, could you tell the difference between Rather, Brokaw, and Jennings? They all had New York sensibilities. Their A blocks were entirely the same, and often their B blocks in the as they built their shows. So it was a little bit of a Matrix-like. It's like there's only one truth. We're telling it, and it's coming off of this little island in New York. And when we came there, I was very proud to be part of the rebels that are saying, look, there's a different point of view out here, and we're going to offer that up. And it worked well. But then I guess when it came to the 2000s, I noticed two things that were happening. One was multiple monopolies were starting to be destroyed. In other words, CNN had a monopoly on cable news. They didn't have to try hard to get an audience. In New York, you had a couple newspapers, but that was pretty atypical, right? In most cities, it had gone down to, hey, we're in Los Angeles. There's one real newspaper here. So they didn't have to cater to an audience. So while their worldview was to the left, in my opinion, and I can probably win that argument anywhere, they didn't have to really reach for it until they had competitors. And I'll never forget when I saw it really starting to come up. It was the Obama-Romney race. And I thought, man, the media is really, really flogging for this guy. And I told my managing editor, I was like, I've never seen the media this biased in my life. and of course, that was, again, still quaint old days. Yeah. What do you see as some of the driving forces that other driving forces, or whether you agree or disagree with that part, that kind of brought, that drove that division more?
Well, I think the biggest single one was digital. I mean, the digital crackup of traditional media, and I think that actually it created two effects, that both of which had a tendency to push newsrooms from the middle. The first was that I think a lot of newsrooms became very smitten by the idea that digital gave them a chance to be as big as television, print newsrooms. It's like there was a kind of build it and they'll come idea that newsrooms didn't have to be confined by the four corners of their printed page. They could reach a different scale. And so they set out to pursue it. And instead of glory and riches following, what followed was disaster. They ended up with the pennies on the dollar in advertising revenue from this bigger scale, and ended up actually in deep financial trouble. And that pressure, that financial pressure, I think caused a lot of newsrooms to lose sight of their core values. I think it caused a lot of newsrooms to chase audience by pandering even more than we might have pandered in the past. I think, all writers and all journalists and everybody's trying to get people's attention. And
they want to get attention, they want to be loved, they want to get the awards, but the
line between valid attention seeking and true pandering is not always easy to spot. And maybe we went too far over it before we realized we'd done it too. So, but I think the pursuit of scale and dollars in a penny on the dollar business of digital, I think both had an enormous impact on the decision making inside newsrooms. And I think a lot of the damage was actually not sort of intentional politics. I don't think it was that they set out to be left or right. I think it was more that the mindset of a lot of newsrooms just didn't see the full range anymore. And also, there wasn't a lot of reward in the middle. The old newspaper model really rewarded the middle. It was really built on the idea that you could assemble a very big, by print standards, you could assemble a big general audience that reached across the community. And the digital model actually broke that. And it became much more important to chase a niche of that audience. And one of the most obvious niches was a political niche.
Right.
So I think there became a lot of pressure to just seem to lean into your audience more. And I think that produced a lot of what we're talking about.
I mean, so I first noticed it, one other thing that I noticed at Fox at kind of during the, from 2000 to 2010 or 2012 was the success of opinion versus news.
Right.
So it's like, we had built our day. So the morning was like the morning show. They'd do the cooking, they'd sit around, they'd jabber on the couch. It was kind of a free flowing, a lot of opinion type thing. Then we went into a hard news day from 9 a.m. really up until later afternoon, probably close to 5. Maybe we'd have one opinion show in there, but then we'd have the Fox Report with Shepard Smith, which was a very pretending to be when Shepard was doing it sometimes, but it was ostensibly a hard news show. It really was a hard news show. Brett Baer, and then it went into all the talkers, and the talkers made at least twice as much money as anybody else on the channel. So all the news guys are looking down at the end of the night saying, why is Bill O'Reilly earning twice as much as me when I'm working harder and running all over and flying off to floods and explosions? And the ratings, same thing was happening. So it was, so we at Fox kept inching up the talk show times to be later in the afternoon. And it's like, okay, well, let what's her name in the middle of the day kind of express her opinions, and it won't be just a straight news show. And the numbers started popping up. The second thing that was clear was that middle, or even the continual exposure to both sides of the ideological debate, wasn't something people wanted as much.
Right.
The numbers went up when we took Combs off of Hannity and Combs. I mean, that used to be a left-right show.
Right.
And when it's just like, it's going to be the all Hannity hour, the numbers went up and people liked it more. We made more money. We beat CNN by bigger levels. And those forces are tough to fight against. I mean, that's just.
Yeah, and actually, it's a really, really great point. And kind of, it goes all the way back to Bill Buckley and firing line. I mean, various people have talked about trying to bring back a show like that, but that was essentially a left-right show, and nobody's done it. Nobody can do it now. There's no Bill Buckley. I mean, he was a very singular, unique figure, but his show was also built on the idea that there was a interesting conversation to have between people of different ideological points of view. And who's doing that today? You and me.
That's kind of interesting. You're right. I want to get into this in a little bit, but for me, well, maybe right now, for me, the golden age of media is actually this right here. Is long format podcasts, whether it's audio or video. I think are out of all the kind of craziness that the internet gave us, from clickbait to chasing things to creating the Kardashians as a 24/7 operation. For all of that badness, two great things came out of it. One was that camera that you could hold up, while and in a news situation or in a world situation, when something happens somewhere, now there's 20 cameras on it, right? That's now that can be abused, and it's often abused. People provoke somebody and then wait till they say something stupid and record it, and people lose their job before they realized it. But the other thing is this long format thing, and this long format concept, which and I want to talk about Joe Rogan, because he's obviously the 800-pound gorilla Actually, about as close as you can come to an 800-pound gorilla now that I think about it. And he started it with zero concept. He's been doing this thing for over 10 years. And he started it with zero concept that he would reach a big audience. And if you recall, we used to chuckle at stuff like that. Oh, a long format. Who wants to watch an hour interview, two guys talking? When you can, with no graphics, no punching things, no, we're going to Cincinnati, no, now the joke segment and reader mailbag. And that, when I first saw him a handful of years, it's like, it felt like, wow, here's a light, because he doesn't have, he's not reaching for, he's reaching for a distinct audience, but it's not in the same way that and his distinction is pretty big. In other words, it's not bland, but it's like, you gotta like a guy who says fuck a lot, who's talking drugs, who's not, he has a lot of things that a lot of ideological people on both sides, they don't agree with that, right? Mm-hmm. But the larger issue of, this is kind of how people are. These are open, interesting conversations where nobody's yelling at each other. There's no fakiness. Nobody's doing the anchor voice right. And it kind of, in the same way that cable news brought more grit and reality and authenticity to what was really crazy, or what was really isolated before, and in the national news, on TV, on CBS Evening News, that there was a lot more authenticity in that. This has done it to another level. So that's my biggest hope for the future, is this long format stuff.
I thought it was incredibly interesting that when Spotify was faced with the choice between Neil Young and Joe Rogan, a choice that a few years ago Neil Young would have won in a heartbeat, they ended up with Joe Rogan.
Now, first of all, they got a deal where they're paying him $100 million, right? And I got a feeling Neil Young albums, I wasn't a massive Neil Young fan, but this was a guy who used to speak power to truth, truth to power, used to be against the government, and now he's like, all you authoritarians, you need to shut that guy up. It was like such a reverse hippie move that it was like, you're just, but people, this pandemic has got people getting nutty in many ways, and that certainly was one of them. But I think that Joe Rogan, besides Donald Trump, has been the first one. So there's a couple guys who have actually stood up against what I consider a full bore media onslaught, right? The first one was Trump, and part of it is just he had that kind of, I mean, he was Trump. He had his own ability to push back. He fought like a like a guy with he fought back crazily. He understood how to turn the attacks into making more publicity for him. And the media's pile-on actually created him as president. He couldn't have been elected 10 years ago. In fact, he ran. I mean, and I think we've seen it a little bit with Jordan Peterson.
He understood what a lot of people in the media didn't understand, which is that going to war with him was good for him.
Yeah. And if he would just go 10% over something, the media would go 50% attacking him, and everybody'd be talking about him. It was a brilliant political strategy, whether you loved or hated him as a person and politician. Jordan Peterson has kind of stood up against this, and Joe Rogan right now. I mean, you look at what they've done to Joe Rogan in just the past couple of months. I mean, here's a guy who, I don't know if you ever watched the show, but he is, he's never being a diatribe. He's got his points of view. He's very into the whole health and this and big workout guy, and he's off he's off the establishment messaging for COVID. Mm-hmm. Has more questions about vaccines, and is also willing to try some of the prophylactic measures that I think are underplayed in the press reflexively, because if this thing works and that's something else, then you weren't going to take a vaccine. So that's kind of been elevated as sainthood status. But his massive size, his distributed audience, and again, I was just saying these last couple weeks with him, He's been first when he came down with COVID, CNN ran a full bore campaign against him, saying he took horse dewormer and all this crazy crap. I'm 100% sure that they changed the video of him to make him look sicker when he made his announcement, because CNN, he looked a little greener and looked a little worse on all of that. They drove that into the ground when he made the point that, hey, this was prescribed by a doctor. Yeah, there's not evidence that they haven't done studies on this drug that I took, but for you to belittle that as a horse dewormer when it's in fact taken by millions of people worldwide is by doctors was nuts. Then they had the big doctor list against him the other day. The Surgeon General of the United States came out and said he should be censored from his platform. Now the WHO is jumping on it as well, and all that shit. And he's going to win. And I think wherever you stand on some of this, that's an encouraging sign that maybe the cancel machine is losing a little bit of its umph. Or I don't know, maybe it's just when somebody's that big, they can fight back better.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting question, and it's interesting too that the WHO, the Surgeon General, I'd much rather see them say he's wrong. He's got the science wrong. He's missed the point about the value of the vaccines. But the minute they go into the vein of he shouldn't be allowed to speak, they're exercising a different authority. And they're experts on public health, but they're not experts on First Amendment, free speech, any of those issues. And I think that's one of the things that Joe Rogan's benefited from, which is that by getting them to overreach, he builds up his strength. I mean, he is wrong about a number of these medical and health issues. He's got a right to be wrong, but the idea that we're going to silence him because he's wrong, as opposed to saying that he's wrong and hope we can get the message out. We not being me, I don't have any public health credentials at all, or any other credentials for that matter. But I do have some sense of the communications challenge that has risen up around COVID. And I think they misunderstand what gets people to listen. I mean, people don't listen to you because you say that guy should be shut up. That doesn't actually win you a single person. That doesn't get one more person vaccinated. But it does help Joe Rogan fight.
Well, and in my mind, he personally is more credible, not necessarily right or wrong, but credible, right. Trying to tell the truth, open to, oh, I was wrong here, you're right. I mean, I've actually seen that happen on there. He's more credible than CNN. He's more credible than to be. It's like, you look at like a guy like Fauci, who people are obviously polarized on, but now there's enough things that I'm like, okay, he knows a little bit more about science than me, right? I got it. But like, eons and very, very smart, but I don't trust that his motives, and I don't trust that he's always believing what he says. And whether it was a small issue in this pandemic, we've learned a lot of things. So it's fair to have changed your mind, saying, oh, I don't believe that this is spread this way, and then later I do. Or, it changed over time. But, and this may seems somewhat small, but no, I actually don't think it is. When he told people not to wear masks, not because he didn't think that people should wear masks, but because he didn't want to have the N95 and PPE depleted in America, which he basically admitted to later.
Right.
That was okay. So he was lying to us about this for what he felt was the greater good. And then the second thing, and this will slowly come out over the next 5 years, I am 1,000% convinced those guys are all lying their asses off on the origin of COVID. And they knew it from 15 minutes in. When somebody woke Fauci up from a nap and said, oh, hey, they're getting this weird, this new weird disease in Wuhan, he knew what happened. He knew, because we were playing all sorts of funding games through third parties. There was a debate in the scientific community about, should you actually be doing that stuff, because it could get released, as it's happened before in China and other places. I mean, SARS came out of a lab and got leaked. And so I'm convinced that 15 minutes into it, he knew exactly what happened. that whether it walked out on the bottom of somebody's shoes, whether it infected somebody there, whether somebody sold a dead bat to, however it did it, that it leaked out of that lab there. And for them to have done that whole same rigmarole, 230 scientists say that the lab leak theory is a conspiracy theory. And of course, back then, because Trump was involved in the mix, the press took that hook, line, and sinker. I mean, it wasn't until Vanity Fair came out, 6 months ago, where they were the first kind of non-conservative source that pulled that apart and had a lot of people then scratching their head. And so, when you ruin your credibility because you do some things like that, you certainly don't have the right to say, I should be the only person speaking.
Right. And I think one of the big lessons that hopefully people will learn from all of this, if you're in any kind of a communications role, if you don't trust your audience is not going to trust you. So if you start with messages that are designed to steer people as opposed to instruct them or help them or share the facts with them, you're going to get in trouble. And I think that's exactly what happened on the mask issue.
And in politics, and in fairness, in politics.
Well, no. I mean, I think many of these things, and in fairness, one thing that hasn't been talked about enough, frankly, is the fact that a lot of these public health issues are not pure science. In other words, sure, follow the science. Great idea. Good phrase. Good Twitter. Good tweet. Or what you and I would have called a bumper sticker once upon a time. Remember bumper stickers?
I do.
But a lot of these choices are not just pure science choices. They're balancing interests. And the minute you're balancing an interest, that's politics. So they should be political. That's actually the wrong criticism. It's not that there won't be politics in this. It's to be clear about what's a scientific point, what's a political point. And also, and this is where I fault both the public health people and the journalists, we are really bad. And I think both the public health people and the media people deserve criticism for this. We're really bad at explaining what we don't know and admitting that there are lots of things we don't know. And admitting that this is our best understanding of a situation at a given moment, not a hard and fast, unchangeable truth. There are very few unchangeable truths in the world. And most of those are beyond our grasp as mortals anyway. So the reality that there are a lot of things that we're only beginning to know, and of course in a pandemic when things are moving and changing all the time, an assertion of certainty is almost always going to be wrong. You have to be willing to say, this is the best I have at the moment, and I'll be back to you with more. I mean, the issue of how COVID, not the issue of the Wuhan Institute, that issue of where it started is clearly something where for some reason many people in the media just decided they knew an answer they didn't know. I mean, it was clear that we didn't know for sure what the right answer was, and they should have just acknowledged ignorance and let it be there for a while until better information emerged. And it's also clear that the Chinese, whether it's intentional deceit or it's just the way they are, were not open and honest at the beginning of this pandemic about what was going on. They weren't even open and honest with their own public health people. The army took over the medical and public health issues and didn't even tell their own CDC what was going on.
I mean, they were honest with some of the people they put in jail to shut up.
Well,
they got it very clear.
So there were a lot of issues about what we knew and what we didn't know, and and we could have been as journalists a lot clearer about the fact that we didn't know a lot of things. Right. And one of the most telling episodes of all, there were a number of really smart people who figured out pretty quickly that this virus spread easily in the air through what they call aerosols. Mm-hmm. But the mainstream public health officials were still convinced and still determined to believe that it spread more like the flu in big globs. Mm-hmm. And big globs sink to the floor quickly. So if it's a big glob, it's going to be on surfaces. It's going to be all over the place. That's why you should wash your hands. That's why you shouldn't touch your face. Remember all that? Don't touch your face. Right. It turns out they were wrong. Okay, they were wrong. But it took them longer than it should have taken them to understand that there were other experts who had knowledge that they didn't have, that they should have listened to more carefully. It took them too long to make that transition. And that is directly related to the issue of why there were these reversals about masks. In other words, if the stuff is spreading and falling onto surfaces, that a mask's not actually that important. But the minute they realized it was spreading in the air, and there were experts who realized that, but they were experts in other subjects. Right. They were experts in aerosol, filtration engineering.
I'd actually worked in aerosolized medicine for a while.
Well, there you are. See, I didn't realize I was here with a resident expert. That's
it was, and back then they didn't even know that much shit either. I mean, it was right. There's always so when you expel something or when you breathe in an aerosolized, there is you could almost plot it out on a chart of large particles versus small particles, and there's going to be a mass in between. And there were always debates, even back then, how big did a particle need? In our instance, it wasn't to get a disease into you. It was how to get a drug into you. How big should that particle be to get that in there? And in the 90s, the early concept was, if the particles are too small, they blow back out. So you want them to be a little larger. But that was then, it's like, okay, well, you look at cigarettes. Cigarettes get nicotine into you like that. And smoke particles are very, very small compared to like aerosolized fluids in there. So even then the science was kind of all over the place as people tried, you get a nebulizer, you put different micron sizes onto something, you have somebody breathe that in and see how much goes in there. Harder to test on a pandemic. I mean, do they still, is that settled that surface transmission is minor on this?
I think that's pretty well what they figured out. It's not non-existent, it's possible, right. But it's not the main way that this is being transmitted. It's mainly being transmitted from person to person through the air.
Yeah, still not shaking hands.
That's just who you are. I mean, I can't change that.
Now it's finally, I don't have to touch you people. Right. I actually love shaking hands and hugging people. I do I'm one of those guys that kind of like, yeah, okay, now I got, did he wash his hands after he went to the bathroom? You ask a couple questions after you.
This program is having real revelations. I mean, the political consultant who didn't like to shake hands. I'm fascinated.
Well, there's a reason I wasn't much of a politician versus that. Well, look, and I can't dismiss just the Donald Trump factor, because I think that the Trump election was the first time that I saw journalists talking publicly. There was the fat kid on CNN. What's his name who does the show? All right, Brian Stelter. He was one of the early. We need to change our priorities as journalists to help save America versus kind of giving a balanced view and telling the truth. I mean, they were like, by just telling the truth, we might not be able to kill Donald Trump. So there was a very public debate going on in the early parts of 2017 where then we saw where everybody went. Everybody just leaped on him, and then clicks followed, right? I mean, the toughest thing to sell in 2017 to today is a story that is telling a nuanced look at Donald Trump, right? Trump was right on this, but he probably went that far, and his excessive behaviors did that. It's going to get how many clicks on Facebook and Twitter. Whereas if you say one extreme or the other, that's your path to.
Yes, this is the he created the vaccine but then kicked it away school of journalism.
Yeah, he told you to put bleach in. It's like as a conservative, I always had a love-hate relationship when the press would obviously go way overboard. For instance, that like the bleach thing. I had liberal friends in Marin saying, I watched what he said, and he didn't fucking say that. It didn't come close to that. Or when you, like the Kyle Rittenhouse case, I think was good at exposing how biased media was, right? Because if you were a person who just read CNN or Newsweek or some of the major sources out there, you had such a wrong view of the events in Kenosha that night. And that then when the trial came up and it was televised, and a lot of people started saying, wait a second, I thought he was chasing down people and shooting black people. Wait a second, I thought that he was a white supremacist who was, and all of those things pulled down. Obviously, people were still, still had different opinions on that, but sometimes when they go completely overboard, it at least causes people to pull back. And from my view, it's usually on one side, but you can argue all that. But then people, if they can say, I need to check multiple sources on things just as a consumer. I used to be able to go to one site and trust it. There's very few sites that I would go to, read anything that had any kind of social or political implication, and just believe it.
Right.
A few. To me, the biggest disappointment in this whole episode was one of your former employers, the New York Times. I mean, the New York Times, I always knew they leaned left, right? And it didn't bother me because they had the smartest writers. They had very good journalists. They would bring in, because of their position, they would get in the top, when they would interview somebody, they would have real substantive experts. When you stumbled online to a New York Times story about whatever that was, you said, all right, now I've gotten to the definitive case on this, and I'm going to learn the most, and I'm going to leave being smarter. And when they joined the club of we're more about politics than about truth and explaining the world to you, that was probably the biggest disappointment. I didn't care that Huffington Post went crazy, right? And people on the left shouldn't care all that much that Fox is going to give you a conservative point of view because everybody knows it. But when the most trustworthy name in news went woke, that hurt. That sucked. Did you? Do New York Times guys talk about that? Do they acknowledge that?
Oh,
do they believe that?
Sure.
And what's going on in that company now, do you think?
Well, I can't say, I can't say for sure what's going on now inside because I am not inside anymore. Right. I think what you're describing, though, both at the New York Times and some other places, was the feeling that we had to actually pass a conclusion, pass judgment. Our job wasn't simply to present the material for which you, the citizen, can make a decision, but that we actually have to take you by the hand and tell you what it means.
Right.
And that's been a process that's been developing in journalism for quite some time. There had to be a take, there had to be a spin, there had to be, right. But Trump, as he did with so many things, pushed everything over the edge. Right. And he, of course, was intentionally trying to do it. He wanted the press to become the enemy. That was his whole strategy. And unfortunately, a fair amount of the American media played right into his hands and did become his opponent in a way that broke the norms of traditional journalism. And the argument, I never bought the argument that because Trump was breaking the norms, journalism should break the norms. That equivalency never made sense to me. It struck me that the more Trump went out over the edge, the more we should stick to our basic values. And one of the reasons for that is, as you said, New York Times journalists and other journalists are good at what they do. They know how to gather information. They know how to present it, so that it doesn't get distorted in the presentation. But we're not any smarter than anybody else. So if you say, well, what's the truth here? I almost never use that word truth because who the hell knows what the truth is? Here's the facts as best I understand them. I'm going to share them with you. That's my job as a journalist. I'm not going to tell you what you should make of these facts because A, that may depend on your own positions and your own views that you bring to the table. And B, I'm not good enough to know. There's a reason why we always used to call journalism the rough first draft of history, because in the pressure of the moment, you can't always know what everything means. You can't always know, quote unquote, the truth. What you can know is what you can learn and what you can find. And frankly, I'm a strong believer that Donald Trump doesn't do well when you actually just show who he is. I don't think that you need to do more than that to capture what a Donald Trump is.
You know, journalists figured out a terrific way to weaponize facts.
Mm.
I mean, you know, Jane Meyer, she is one of the worst examples of that. She's smart. She's beloved. She takes down a conservative every 3 to 6 months. But she generally writes things that are true, but she is an expert at putting them all together, excluding any facts that are outside of her narrative. She comes up with a narrative: Brett Kavanaugh is probably a rapist. And if you read the story that she did on him, especially now when it's in the back, you know, it's like everything in that story was true, but so crazily distorted that it's a lie. I mean, that it is, you know, I always talk about, you know, Fox News could have done a story saying Pete Buttigieg gave a speech wearing underwear and socks to a gay audience. And that was undoubtedly true. It just takes ignoring the fact that he was wearing a suit and a tie and shoes and pants.
Right.
And I got into the Jane Meyer thing again recently. You know, she had gone after Fox and me a couple of years ago, and you know, where she interviewed me for 2 hours, didn't ask about a certain issue, turned that into a 600 words of her thing, and literally didn't ask me one word about it, because she wasn't after the truth. She was after factoidal nuggets that she could use to, and then with the requisite denial, no, we didn't do that, and into presenting a good picture. And that's the scariest part. You know, lies are easy to overcome. What's hard to overcome is when you say, okay, candidate X is giving a rally, go to that rally, find out the biggest retards and racist and people, get them to say stupid things, get it on tape, and then that's our function here, and ignore all those people over there, ignore 95% of it. And yeah, the lying by telling true facts, I think has become an art form to some of the larger journalists now.
So part of what we're talking about here, Ken, is something that I know you care about, and you and I have talked about a lot, which is the more we get media that falls into camps along with the political polarization, and whether it's on the left or on the right, the more the middle just disappears. We don't have a media of the middle anymore, and we don't have a media that's just there to serve, that's there to help give you the material to be a citizen, not tell you how to be a citizen or what kind of citizen you should be. And I know you've thought about that a lot, but why do you think we've had so much trouble maintaining something in the middle?
Look, I think for all the reasons we said, that the middle doesn't sell. I actually think the Fox News model was, and still can be, it's rough around the edges, pretty damn good, in the sense of attaching people with very, very definite points of views with news reporters that are doing their best to tell a story straight. Now, obviously, they're going to be covering different stories, right? Fox today is covering the funeral of a slain cop. I bet CNN isn't spending nearly as much time on that, but I bet CNN will find a gay guy who got beat up and in a hate crime, and they will cover. I mean, yeah, there is that. But you know, one thing that I would, that when I ran kind of the West Coast reporters for Fox, it was just one simple sentence was, give both sides their best shot. That's all you had to say to a reporter. You know, right. They jam it all down into a minute 10, right? I mean, in news, TV news is very, very condensed. And you know, my girlfriend's she's an on-air reporter for Fox, and she just does it. She interviews these people, and she says, okay, she doesn't look at, let's get the stupidest person on this side, or where he did something this, and the smartest person on this side, and put that into a piece. It's just the desire to say, I'm going to give both sides their fair shot in this issue. That solves 80% of the world's ills, or 80% of journalists' ills, which,
by the way,
it's not as fun.
Yeah. By the way, just to dissent slightly from something you said, and I haven't been watching CNN, so I can't directly respond to what you said about CNN, but I am here in New York, where we just lost 2 police officers in a horrifying shooting. And my observation about the television coverage in general, and I'm mostly just watching the main network news outlets, is that they've been deeply respectful and have honored these 2 officers, and have not fallen into any kind of a trap of, we still have to pay lip service to some other movement that says that the police aren't right. I mean, these 2 officers are really being treated as not just the heroes that they are, they're being treated as really devoted young men who wanted to serve and who found their role in life as police officers, and that there's really something wrong that those 2 people died in a completely preposterous situation that reveals so many things that are wrong, both, and I'll manage to go at both left and right here. I mean, that guy should not have had those weapons. I mean, this guy was armed to the teeth with illegal weapons. He had a Glock with a revolving magazine. I mean, there is no reason why anybody in this country needs a weapon like that, frankly. I don't know what way to. So there's something wrong with the gun piece of this. And those 2 officers ran right smack into that. But this is also a guy who clearly had severe mental health issues, a guy who had been repeatedly imprisoned. I mean, there are so many things wrong with this picture. But the one thing I'm not seeing and I've been paying close attention to a lot of the coverage, I am not seeing you see, this is what the police deserve, or this is what the police are going to get, or this
because people probably burn them down at this point. But
well, right.
Well, here, let me put it this way: if that shooting happened 4 years ago, I mean, how many cops die in the line of duty every year in America? It's about 300 or so.
Is that the number?
It changes around. That's the number that sticks in my mind. I think that most of those were shot. Some of them die. Another popular way that police die in action is chasing somebody in a car and having a fatal wreck on that. But that meant that 6,000 police died over a 20-year journalistic career, and we paid attention to 10 of them over time. I'm not saying that that's, obviously you can't pay attention to every murder in America when there's 15,000 people being killed every year. But now, because people are seeing kind of the breakdown in social order in their city, and now it's like, hey, actually, cops and criminals, this is a more important thing than it was for you walking to the grocery store than it would have been 4 years ago. That we are now into that world, which in this instance is probably a fair and good thing. Right. But,
and Mayor Adams Eric Adams is mayor of New York because of that trend you just described.
What do you think of this guy?
I think it's a very interesting figure. He's trying to carve out by New York standards, a moderate political democratic position that takes crime seriously, that takes public safety seriously, but that also obviously recognizes social issues and social problems and the need for government action to address them. So he's trying to carve out a different kind of middle of the road politics that's frankly more like the old Democratic Party than the woke left Democratic Party.
Right.
And and he's pretty explicit about it. He doesn't sort of sneak around about it. He criticizes some of the more progressive members of the New York political delegation. And he's up there wearing police and fire paraphernalia at every chance he gets.
Could he have done that if he was white in this?
I don't know. And it's a completely interesting question. And in a way, the answer is, well, good for him. I mean, if part of what he's doing is redefining racial politics in this country to move the politics to a better place, that's more power to him.
Right.
I don't know the answer to that question. And I don't know that there's any way to know it without having, a real example. I mean, you'd have to have somebody run for office with his politics, but a different race. I don't know.
Well,
I don't know what would happen.
Did somebody relatively pro-cop run against him in the Democratic primary?
No, there weren't. He was probably, well, I mean, first of all, he was the only one who had actually been a police officer.
Right.
So that was,
so he kind of had that.
By that, he sort of just had that
That was part of who he was, right?
Yeah. So I think it's certainly, I think there were a unique set of circumstances in that race, including the fact that he's a police officer. On the other hand, I think there's a lot that can be generalized from that race. And he would be the first to tell you that. I mean, he's not shy about trying to tell the rest of the country and the rest of the Democratic Party that he thinks he's got the model for the future.
Right.
And whether he's right or wrong, and whether the Democratic Party will agree with him is, will be an interesting thing to follow. But I think it's interesting and important. I mean, I don't think it's a small development. I mean, that he's come into office determined to, I mean, he's restored the plainclothes anti-gun units that were so criticized, and probably validly criticized, for some of their abuses in the Black community. And yet his point was, well, we've got to cure the abuses, but we can't throw away the need to shut down the gun crimes. So he's taken, as you said, he's taking another try at coming up with aggressive anti-gun policing, while saying we're not going to go back to some of the old abuses. And we'll see if he can find that line.
And New York, you poor guys, you've outlawed guns ever since I was born, and you still can't fix that problem, huh?
Right.
Yet in my neighborhoods, we have lots of guns and no crime. So
right.
I don't know. Maybe it's just me.
Yeah. And by the way, it's not only New York. I mean, it's a lot of big cities in this country have this problem of a category of illegal, off the books guns. These are not regular citizens exercising their Second Amendment rights.
Right.
This is a different group of people. These are
right.
gang
right.
members, drug dealers, petty criminals of all sorts. I mean, part of the problem is it's just so easy to get a very powerful gun and then use it the first moment you lose your temper. We had an incident here in New York the other day where two guys were in the waiting room of a hospital in the Bronx. A hospital. They were in the hospital. Right. This guy was in the hospital because he was getting treatment for a previous gunshot wound. Right. And while he's in the hospital, this right. other guy sees him and thinks that he's looking at him badly. I don't know whether he was or wasn't looking at him badly, but he says, "What are you looking at?" And the guy says, he growls at him. The guy pulls a gun and shoots him. There's something wrong with that picture. There really is. And even with the Second Amendment, even with Second Amendment rights, it's too easy to be walking around. And by the way, these are not, these are illegal guns.
I'll give you a yes, but on that. It always seems to happen in certain areas and not in other areas. You go to Phoenix, and there are guys walking around open carrying in the grocery store in Phoenix. And I remember looking at and trying to say, okay, because a lot of states are very, very open on firearms. I live in California where they're trying to ban pea shooters, and it will be a continual fight, possibly to the death.
Right. I just want to say for the record, I just don't think you should have a pea shooter.
Yeah, well, it's a little late for that. And you don't see when in states and regions that have liberalized gun laws, you don't see scientific or statistical evidence of that anecdote you got. You don't see guys just shooting each other over traffic conditions and things like that. That just doesn't seem to be a driver of numbers. And I'm sure somebody will say, no, here's this study, and I don't trust half the people that are in that world because they're worse than the press trying to get rid of or elect Donald Trump. But I actually find it's kind of, especially, so New Yorkers are funny because there's such a little gun atmosphere there.
Right.
Everybody kind of that who has a gun or uses one is either a cop or a criminal. Whereas you go to Idaho or parts of rural California even, or Texas or other places, everybody has one, and it's just a different world on that. And so that's why, they always used to call me up on the gun stores, because I would be one of the only persons, even at Fox, a conservative place, that actually would own firearms, go to a range, just keep them as part of that for my life. And to be honest, I don't even keep them for crime as much as I keep them for if this society ever falls apart, I'd rather have 20 guns in the basement of my house than not. Yeah, it
Yes,
sounds,
which I'll admit is why I'm coming to your house when the society.
yeah, I
falls
mean, it
apart.
sounds a little paranoid until you just take any 100-year look at history on the planet. And you and I have both been to places that have fallen to shit.
Right. And I think what's I don't obviously I do think we can be tighter about guns than we are in parts of the country without any loss of your certain basic right. But what's I think most important about the point you're making is that it isn't the gun in itself. It's the gun combined with the mental health, combined with the drugs, combined with the criminal activity. It's all of that, all of it. It's a stew. That's where the violence and the danger is. It's obviously not. I mean, it's obviously not you. You're not the threat.
Yeah. Interestingly, the Washington Times, this was probably 15, 20 years ago. So we all report things when they're unusual, right? Which means we don't report most murders in Chicago because they happen every day, and you would have a newscast filled with that. The Times about 20 years ago, and I knew the guy who was on this project. What would normally happen in Washington is you'd have the Southeast minority, heavy crime, heavy drug, most murders. So a high profile murder would get a lot of attention, and those would never be covered just because it wasn't that. And they decided for, I think it was at least a year, to assign a reporter to every single murder that happened within Washington, D.C.
Right. And
to do the calls, to talk to the cops, to talk to the, find the case and write a story on that. And interesting, I asked this guy, I said, what's your takeaway on that? And his takeaway was, most of the murders happening in Washington were drug sellers killing each other. Mm-hmm. That drugs, sometimes it was bygone bad, but that the hardcore drugs was kind of underlying the vast majority of murders there. I don't know if that's still the case. I don't know how much those numbers change. For me, the best thing to come out of the BLM movement, which we can get into if you want, which I think is going to set back most Black Americans in the goals that they're trying to achieve, but whatever, is the cop cams, the body cams on police officers. And there's a great YouTube site if you're interested in seeing that. It's not easy to watch all of that, but now almost every city is getting smart, right, and releasing these kind of right away when somebody gets killed by a cop. And you see, sometimes you see some bad cop actions. 95% of the time, you're like, man, I would have killed that guy faster or quicker. And a couple things jumped out as I've watched probably at least 100 of these over the last year. One is probably up to 50% of guys who are shot by, and it's almost always guys, it's 95% male versus female, some females. Right. They were trying to kill themselves. They were, many of them they're literally running at a cop screaming, fucking kill me, shoot me, and swinging at him with a knife. That is a good chunk. Then there's a big chunk that you're kind of not sure whether they were trying to kill themselves or whether their rage button just kicked in. They were beating up their wife, the cops come, they come out, they grab a baseball bat, and they just went into rage mode. You've seen people do that in driving or in various situations, and the cops shoot them. Some of them were that cop probably didn't need to do that 7 times, or he had enough room. Sometimes the guys flip and turn, and so you see the good and the bad use of force, and it's not the impression that anybody has in America on the "we hate cops" movement. I mean, and there are literally people who are like, you shouldn't call the police on your stolen car because it might lead to a Black interaction with cops and that person could get killed. It's like, nobody got shot in any of these for just, nobody who pulled over and said, oh, okay, officer, and didn't pull a gun or try to run or run with the cop hanging out the door or whatnot. I mean, the incidents of that are almost minuscule. Not zero, but pretty damn close to it.
And one of the things I think you're capturing in this is this phenomenon of suicide by cop is a very tip of a very, very, very deep iceberg in this country of mental illness.
Yeah.
And to be honest, if I had only one thing that I could do in terms of the crime problem in this country, and there's no reason why we should do only one thing. We should do all the right things to do, and we can debate what the right things are. But if I could only do one, it would be to take another start at the problem of how do we deal with the violent mentally ill, because we've really blown that one big time. And this was not, I mean, New York is a poster child for how badly we've blown it, but it's happened all over the country. You know, we decided as a society that institutionalizing thousands and thousands of seriously mentally ill people was both inhumane and unaffordable. So we decided we were going to change. So we took all these people and put them out of their hospital beds. This is, you know, nearly half a century ago.
60s, late 50s.
And we never fixed it. We never came up with, okay, so that's fine. We're not going to keep them locked up in hospitals. But what are we going to do? And, you know, this poor woman, Michelle Alyssa Go, is dead today because we didn't solve that problem 40 years ago. And she was shoved off a subway platform in Times Square by a severely mentally ill man who was in and out of treatment and in and out of jail, and who was never put into the proper programs. There are programs, there are ways to deal with this. But as a society, we have really blown that one. And if we fix that, it would fix a lot of the other problems. It wouldn't completely eliminate the gun issue, but it would put there would be fewer guns in the hands of seriously mentally ill people.
Yeah.
And that would be a major step.
I don't think that we have good solutions for that, for a handful of reasons. And part of it is I think that psychology is still an evolving field. I mean, you know, when you look at it, saying it's like, okay, probably one of the largest goals of the psychological community would be to stop people from killing themselves. That's a pretty bad thing to happen, and it's all a mental issue on that, right? And suicide numbers aren't down in America. They're not spiking, but they're but you know, they've never, we've not seen them have any widespread support. We've seen cancer solutions come down. We've seen people dying or living longer with heart conditions, living longer with all those, but we kind of haven't figured that part out. And then there's always that, you know, you ask this question all the time: is that guy stupid or is he evil? And and that's not exactly what I'm talking about with mentally ill, but there's a question of when you see a guy saying, "You go fuck yourself," and pulling a gun at another guy in a hospital, you know, it's like, is he a bad person, or is he a broken person, or maybe both? And how do you fix that?
Right.
And I don't know what the solutions. I mean, clearly, reinstitutionalization of some people who really need it is an important thing. I mean, I don't know what the streets of New York are like, but when I go into certain parts of San Francisco, you know, it's heartbreaking to see somebody lying down on top of themselves in a wheelchair that is clearly mentally ill, and people are just, including me, just walking by. It's like, because, you know, if that guy had a broken leg, we'd be like, oh my God, this guy has a broken leg or he's bleeding. We'd help, we'd call things, you'd do it. Instead, let the guy sleep out overnight because it doesn't get to freezing in San Francisco.
Yeah, no, and we have a fair amount of that here in New York as well. Although I must say, I've never seen a city in America as bad as San Francisco on this front. And I don't know quite the combination of events. You know, there is a program in New York State that was the first of its kind when it was inaugurated, but I think a number of other states now practice something similar. And it all goes back to a horrifying case of a woman named Kendra Webdale, who something like 25 years ago was shoved off a subway platform by a schizophrenic man and died, very similar to the case we just had last week with Michelle Go. And after her death, her family really rallied to the cause of doing something. Like, they didn't want the death to be in vain, and you got to admire them for this. And so they passed a law here in New York State, which they actually called Kendra's Law. And it both created and gave judges the power to require a kind of outpatient psychiatric treatment for people with serious mental illness, so that you can enforce their medication, you can keep close tabs on them, you can recognize if they're deteriorating, which is, one of the serious problems for the mentally ill is that being mentally ill and out on the streets is a recipe for getting worse.
Right, and then you throw drugs right into that.
So we have a stew, especially in big cities, where we just create really nightmare situations. So anyway, the state of New York adopted a program of outpatient therapy that wasn't voluntary. It could be voluntary. You could just volunteer to take it, but it could be imposed. So for example, if you were arrested on some crime, the judge could rule that part of your sentence had to be, you must enroll in this program. And actually one of the big unanswered questions about the death of Michelle Go last week is why the guy who shoved her off the platform wasn't in such a program, because the program exists. So I think a lot of what we're looking at in this country, I take your point about we're still in search of all the solutions, but there are a couple of very simple things that exist. And that if we could just be more vigilant, and if government could be more competent about making sure these things are really in use. It's clear there are some thousand people or so in this program right now, and it's very clear there are many more people in New York State who should be in this program and could be if the cops, the prosecutors, the judges, the outreach people, the social workers, if they were all just more vigilant about getting more people into the program, it would make a big difference. And it's not rocket science. It's an existing program.
How hard is it to get drugs easily in New York?
Well, I don't know from personal experience, I have to say. Right. By the way, I have to say, I'm going to share one thing that isn't the full answer to your question. It is now very easy, of course, to get cannabis.
Well, yeah.
Both legally, illegally, of course, but it's also now, there is a cannabis shop right around the corner from me on the block that used to be known as Needle Park.
Right.
Many moviegoers will know that even if they don't know New York.
Right.
There was this place that was made famous in the movie Panic in Needle Park. There's now a legal cannabis shop on that park. So whatever you want to make of the societal change that's happened, I think most other drugs in this city are pretty easy to get. And it's a big illegal business. And of course, that's where a lot of the gun violence comes from, is, turf battles over drug distribution. But there's a lot of drugs in this city.
In San Francisco, they still have. So you can drug addicts can always you can always get your dope somewhere, right? Somebody who knows somebody. But one of the things that made the San Francisco homeless problem even worse is that they literally have an obvious open air place that I could go walk to in certain neighborhoods in San Francisco today and buy drugs. So if you're you got off the bus, you're coming in from a place, you're on the spectrum, but pretty close to the messed up spectrum. Drugs are part of your world. You don't have to search around for it. It's there right in front of you. Obviously, if you're an addict, you literally watch people inject themselves on city streets in San Francisco. And I know from experience with whiskey that I'm watching a TV show and the guy's like popping up some whiskey and it's like, you know what? Pause the movie for a second. I want a Jack Daniels. I do that all the time. And I can't imagine if you are a drug, an intravenous drug user also with screwed up problems in your head, that seeing people in those states continually using crazily easy to get doesn't make that 10 times easier for you to fall back into that world, even if you weren't trying to do it aggressively.
Yeah. It's one of our great tragedies, frankly, is our inability. We spent billions of dollars on a war on drugs to try to cut off the supply, and we clearly failed. It didn't work. And then, of course, the problem that so much of our drug problem now is not the old-fashioned heroin. It's this, the new fentanyl and
that's the one that's killing people. Yeah.
These new opiates.
The heroin guys are the ones who then go stab somebody to death. The fentanyl guys are the ones who are overdosing and dying from that. It's something. And look, I'm pretty liberal on liberalizing most drugs, because it's kind of like I'm fine on psychedelics. I was fine on cannabis for years, and the libertarian part of me is like, hey, just because you can't handle your shit doesn't mean it should be illegal for me, right? Like gambling. I'm sorry if you gamble away your house. That's not my problem, but it shouldn't be legal for me to do whatever, to have a poker party or go to a casino because you can't handle your shit, right?
Right. By the way, we sure have crossed a line on gambling, haven't we? I mean, it's all on my phone now. Sports betting. I mean,
Yeah.
I went to a college that was banned from college sports because we were shaving points.
And you can now bet.
And now I could even go bet on my college teams, I think. I don't know. Can you bet on college teams in sports betting? But
I don't know. I have a friend who's got a startup. It's actually doing very well in that gambling space. And there's still a lot of legal, it's all kind of a legal play on that. So what their concept is you can do your gambling there. What they do though is when you put your $20 into the computer or into, you pay your $20 to be part of this thing, they go and place your bets on horse racing around the world, because horse racing is legal and even off-track betting is legal in most states, and it's controlled under a whole separate thing. So they put it on that, and you either, you won some, lost some, and that's behind the scenes, and then you're playing your little game online and they're giving you back your money, but they're really giving you back your money because they placed a legal bet for you on a horse somewhere, or a compendium of that. It's kind of, it's a lot of work to get around a short problem. Hey, I want to shift for a second. Local media and local journalism. So you had written a piece 15 years ago now about kind of the decline and the decline of local journalism,
right? Which
I find one of the big problems that we have, even though it's not an in-your-face obvious problem.
Right.
It's a, and in New York, in San Francisco, in the major areas, it's irrelevant. And of course, if something's irrelevant in New York, nobody cares about it on a national level. But the lack of resources and news that's earning money for a 40,000 population town somewhere, which means they're not sending a reporter to the city council. It's gotten washed away. It's within the TV of a large, Bell, California was probably the best example of that. If you recall, a handful of years ago, Bell, California, in Los Angeles, Hispanic, probably 95% Hispanic, heavily, probably the majority of them primarily spoke Spanish at home. It was, within LA County, but it didn't have its own newspaper. LA Times isn't going to write a whole lot of things on that. The right. TV news, it was too small. It was 40,000, 50,000 people, too small to care all that much. And the city council there just went hog wild. I mean, people were making hundreds of thousands of dollars. I mean, it was like they turned it into an organized crime zone. And it wasn't until several years of that where it got where they got so greedy that it became popular. Have you seen financially, and I don't mean just the billionaires who say, well, I'm going to put some we've seen some of them trying with Civitas and some other things to get some local reporting going back, although I don't trust billionaires when they put too much money into media, because they sometimes have an agenda, and sometimes that's not the same as my agenda. Do you see any bright light or in that world?
First of all, I think this is so much the biggest problem we're facing in journalism. I think this collapse of local news is far more dangerous and far more disturbing, even than all the problems we've been talking about the big national places. And by the way, it is a problem here in New York. Mm-hmm. It's not the case that it's only a problem in small towns.
You're right, because
it's a problem
it's the small chunks of New York.
Yeah. Right. And frankly, if you look at what's happened here in New York, yes, the New York Times is still here in the sense that its name is still on the newspaper, but it's not here the way it once was as a force in local journalism. They still do some stories about New York, but they're not covering New York the way they used to. The Daily News is a shell of what it once was. Your friends at the Post are actually the most energetic and aggressive these days. But even these big citywide papers, really can't get down on the street from neighborhood to neighborhood. So there
It's
are
got to be the
whole
smaller ones.
there are whole swaths of New York that used to have much more coverage than they have. So the collapse of local news is a very serious problem in this country. I do see a lot of people trying to come up with solutions, and I see some encouraging things happening, and I'd like to see more momentum for them, and I'd also like to see more people view this as the real important issue to solve. So, for example, I believe that local news, even though obviously there's partisan politics even at the local level, it's also an easier place for people of different points of view to come together and say, okay, we're going to make this work. We're going to make sure we have local news here. Because frankly, if you don't have a way to talk about basic local issues, if you can't talk about where to put a sewage plant,
right,
if you can't talk about, what are the public safety issues in your community, you can't have a society. I mean, all this debate at the national level and all the polarizing, it's worrisome. There's things to talk about, but it's absolutely essential to have local information and local communication.
But companies like AOL lost billions.
Right. And that was
I actually tried to set up a series, probably 15 years. I was still at Fox. I was doing it as a side project to set up some hyper-local websites in my neighborhood, and in an online thing. And I didn't exhaust all the possibilities, but when you try to use the standard economic, advertising per eyeball, on a local thing like that, you could make $10,000 a year in a town the size of Calabasas, California, for instance.
Right.
And that's not enough. That's not enough to get you half a reporter, let alone anything
right
else.
Absolutely. So I think there are a couple of things though that you begin to see working. First of all, if you can put together a chain of those, of what you just described, enough of them so that you can aggregate the advertising, and if you also ask people to help pay for it. I mean, people
it might be the second, but the first thing is what AOL did. What do they call all their hyperlocal sites? They had 1,000 of them. Right?
Yeah, and there are and others have now followed in their footsteps. I mean, Patch is essentially similar to what AOL tried to do. And
no, I think Patch is the same company.
Right. No, but I mean, it's the same purpose. It's the same idea.
Yeah. No, but I mean, I think that Patch is the
successor.
Is the successor.
Right.
It's a successor.
Yeah, no, that's true. But there are chains of community papers, for example, in New York that are doing fine. They make money, and they, some of them also take subscriptions from their readers, and others take only from their advertisers.
If I trusted a young person not to go too crazy on the politics, I say young person, doesn't have to be a young person, I would pay $5 a month to have somebody who was investigating what my local city did, what it did that. I mean, but I've never seen those become successful. I mean,
well, it's hard. It's a lot of work, and nobody's going to get rich doing that.
I mean, a girl shows her boobs. She can pay her rent on OnlyFans, but there's no kind of a similar setup on a journalistic side like that. I wonder if it can be merged with. There's Nextdoor. Are you familiar?
Right.
Nextdoor's been around for 10 years. And they're basically this is Facebook, but you have to live. It's Facebook for you and your neighbors.
Right.
And you literally had to get a postcard. You had to prove you lived within that zip code to be part of that thing. But there's no professionalism on that, right? That's what they've got is, it's usually just people bitching about things, but that's where I find the most amount of news. When there's a traffic accident, maybe somebody saw it and wrote about that. But again, mainly and somebody had a guitar playing last night at 9:30. But I wonder if there's a merging of a social thing on that with a social site like a Nextdoor to be merged with, and in this Nextdoor area where if you want to pay to actually have somebody, go ask the city council questions and to go file Freedom of Information Act requests and to go find out, what those major issues are going on. I just don't. I think we need that somehow.
I totally agree. And actually, if after this call you want to get together and see if we can build it, I'm with you.
Dude, I've lost so much money trying to. So I lost I lost probably $100,000, $200,000 on trying to find a local solution. Then
Right.
after I got bounced out of Fox, I said, let's get a real fair and balance. Let's bring a guy from NPR. Let's bring a guy from Fox News and try to do that. Lost my ass on that. And of course was branded as a reactionary right-wing Russian troll by the formerly best newspaper in the planet that turned into a piece of shit. So yeah, no, I'm out. I'm out fixing this problem. But you write for a local.
I do. I actually work with a chain of community papers here in New York called Strauss Media that actually does a lot of good service. I mean,
but I think I saw you bitching about Trump mainly in there, weren't you?
That's not my usual. It's not my usual topic. Although I have been known to do it. And
I was going to bring one up. I was going to bring one up because they did the it's like there was a picture of Trump looking like an idiot, and then there was a picture of Rudy Giuliani who looked like you just set him on fire. He was like, the Rudy Giuliani is crazy. Right. Roger Ailes always used to say, "Is like Ken, photo editors are sadistic bastards." So when he would get an interview done by them, he would never let them take the picture. He'd be like,
right.
You can either have a picture that I give you and use it, or you can go pound sand. And I learned that lesson actually when I ran my college newspaper, and the local newspaper wanted to do a profile on the college editor, right? It was Claremont, California. I'll never do this again. Oh, well, I said I did it again because the New York Times screwed me too. And the guy gave while I was doing an interview, a photographer with a little longer of a lens just sat there and take pictures as I was talking, so that literally the picture would be was like this, halfway through that. Now, the New York Times did something more intentional, put a shadow on me and made it look like I was duplicitous. But photographers can be as evil as any journalist in their own way if you let them.
Well, one of the things that's really, I think, both interesting and heartening about local news and the local audiences, to go into my own experiences, I've occasionally done stuff about Trump, but I don't do it very often because nobody cares. It's not what people are really interested in. What they're really interested in is what's happening in my block, what's happening in my neighborhood. My story this week, in fact, is about the new district attorney and whether he's going to prosecute serious crimes in the county. Right. And that people are really interested in.
I might have been confusing an article that I saw that you had written somewhere else versus, because it had big pictures, because you wrote a bunch on a building that was the Bloodworks building that was trying to go from a 2-story building to a 20-story building.
That's the kind
and
of
you
stuff.
had 10 stories on that, which I thought was like,
what's going to be what will development rules be? There was a big controversy here in my neighborhood over where to put homeless people during the pandemic. These really gritty local issues that are actually quite substantive. They're not easy often. They're often very difficult, and they involve trade-offs. But people really want to talk about the substance of them, and there'll be big disagreements. It isn't that there isn't fierce argument in politics, but it isn't rote. It's much more pragmatic, and I find that heartening. Actually, it doesn't mean we couldn't kick that away. But
where's the media going in the next 5 years?
Well, I hope, and I actually have some optimism that we're gonna recognize that we're not as all-knowing as we like to paint ourselves. And therefore, our determination to be the final judge and jury of the political realm is not a good role for us. That we're not actually that good at that role.
Why do you think we'll realize that now?
Because I think it's costing us a lot, actually. I don't think it's actually working for a lot of news organizations. It drove a lot of traffic when we had Trump to help us polarize.
Who may be coming back for another 4
Trump,
years, but okay.
And his return would actually be a difficult problem for media, because I think it would call the question of, are we just going to go back to the same ride the wave of polarization, which leads to a shaky kind of journalism, or are we going to actually try to be the kind of journalism that says, I'm not going to tell you what the right answer is, but I'm going to give you everything I can to help come to the right answer, because that's what we're good at. That's what we know how to do. And I do see that happening, by the way, in local journalism. I see people really setting out to try to understand problems and explain them, sometimes in a really aggressive investigative way, sometimes just in a more explanatory way, but always with a real eye toward what's the service I can give. And I think if we see our journalism as a service to people, not as an end in itself and not as a political role, I think we'll be better.
Yeah, see, I don't see that happening, because I think that journalists who slammed the president or vice versa as hard as they could, felt in their heart that they were saving America, that they've equated getting their political ends done with journalism. And I think we've got now a whole class of young people who didn't even come close to ever having kind of the whole tell both sides story fairly journalism. And that they don't believe that it's bad. I think that they really feel that exposing Republicans, who obviously hate people and they hate homeless people, that is the path towards making a better society. And I get more clicks, and I get more friends giving me high fives at the party, and I still get more money from who was the CNN guy, who was the CNN White House reporter who used to get into it with Trump, and he was he wrote a book.
Jake Tapper?
No, the loudmouth guy who was always getting into the fights at the press.
That doesn't narrow.
Yeah. Tapper out of almost all the guys there. I like Tapper. Anyhow, the one that everybody that was the very highest polarized one, who just said that Virginia is like North Korea because of Youngkin's fight against critical race theory, and was complaining about that he still had the lashes from the Trump presidency, but became popular, wrote a book, made tons of money on that. I still see the rewards, both psychological and financial, paying for extremism and point of view politics.
I think the two of us laid out the
heaven and the hell.
The heaven and the hell here, right? I mean, there are a lot of bad incentives out there, and those incentives have gotten worse. I agree with that, and I think, on the other hand, we haven't saved America. I mean, we may have thought we were saving America, but what have we accomplished? I mean, where are we? I think we have to have more faith in the people we allegedly serve. I mean, this goes back to that whole conversation we had about, if you don't trust your audience is not going to trust you. And we have operated in a way that doesn't send a message of trusting our audience. It sends a message of pandering to our audience.
And then you have to be careful of your audience when you disagree with them.
Right.
If Sean Hannity truly believed that the election wasn't stolen, and he said that on his show, his ratings would drop 20%.
Yeah.
And similarly, if Rachel Maddow said, you know what, I think all of the global warming predictions have gone way, way overboard. It's getting warmer, but I don't think it's going to be that bad. I think that the rise in oceans will be consistent as to what they've been throughout the last 10 years, 3 millimeters per year, and that's nothing by the time I'm dead. If she said that, she would be less popular. She would lose an audience, and they all have that to worry about.
I think part of where I agree with you, in a sense, is that I think there's a lot of bad incentives out there. And obviously one of the incentives is if you say something that isn't what your audience expects you to say, you could be in trouble. And that's true on both the left and the right.
Right.
And it takes a certain spine to say, I'm in this for the long run. I'm not just in this for today. And I'm gonna try to make a go of it by giving people reality. Mm-hmm. And that's what journalism used to be about. I don't even know that journalism was ever about truth, but I do hope we were at least trying to be about reality. And the simple fact is, and frankly, Trump's mishegas about stolen elections is the best example there is of that. This election wasn't stolen. He lost. And journalists who insist on saying that it might have been stolen because they're worried their audience won't like it if they say something else are actually digging themselves deeper into a hole that they'll never escape from. And you're right. The incentives...
or journalists who out and out refuse to look into a lot of hinky stuff.
Right.
And look, half the reason why the right thinks that is because nobody seriously investigated any of this shit. not one news organization that you know of or that we know by name on as a mainstream legacy news organization actually said, you know what? Why did they kick people out at a certain hour? Or where did that trunk come from? Or those late night shifts, let's really get into this. Man, it was a whole lot of, nope, Trump's gone, fuck you. This is, of course not. And would I be shocked if some of those things come out to have some element of truth at the bottom of them? No, I wouldn't. Have any of them been there? No, but you know.
Well, although as the legitimate conservative and Republican reviews of this election say, this is not me speaking, this is the conservative groups that have taken a close look at this election, they all say that there was no pattern of troublesome issues. What was your word? Hinky? there was no pattern of hinky behavior any different from any previous election, and none of it would have been big enough to change the results of the election. And,
I get that claim, and I think it's probably the case. I just don't think it's been investigated, and I don't think anybody has a way to say that, right? I mean,
right.
Now part of it is, look, part of it was 98% or 92% of journalists were so thrilled that he was gone and that America was saved and that we're not going to be Nazi Germany in the next 4 years, that there was no serious looks at any of that. The other part of it is I've been involved in a lot of journalistic investigations. You don't uncover shit like that in 3 weeks, right? I mean, you know, there are people who have won awards for uncovering electoral voter fraud. That takes a year. It takes somebody to turn. It takes it takes time and resources on that, and neither there have been. You know, there was no time on obviously in an election, and certainly no resources. So, I mean, would I be shocked if we learned some things? No. But have I seen anything that I'm like, aha, there's a smoking gun? You know, every smoking gun that I heard about, came to be nothing, and there we go. All right, Mike, this was a quick.
It's
hour
good to
40.
see you, Ken. I'm making a note that 5 years from now we're going to come back and do this again to see how journalism's done.
Now we'll do it earlier. We'll when Trump. I think he's coming back in, and I think the whole world will explode again. That's if I had to pay attention to that. But
from your lips to wherever.
from my lips to somebody.
All right. Great to see you, though.